محمد وآل محمد صلوات. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما فلن أكلم اليوم إنسيا. فأتت به قومها تحمله قالوا يا مريم لقد جئت شيئا فريا. يا أخت هارون ما كان أبوك امرأ سوء وما كانت أمك بغيا. فأشارت إليه قالوا كيف نكلم من كان في المهد صبيا. قال إني عبد الله آتاني الكتاب وجعلني نبيا وجعلني مباركا أينما كنت وأوصاني بالصلاة والزكاة ما دمت حيا وبرا بوالدتي ولم يجعلني جبارا شقيا. والسلام علي يوم ولدت ويوم أموت ويوم أبعث حيا. ذلك عيسى ابن مريم قول الحق الذي فيه يمترون. ما كان لله أن يتخذ من ولد سبحانه إذا قضى أمرا فإنما يقول له كن فيكون. وإن الله ربي وربكم فاعبدوه هذا صراط مستقيم. فاختلف الأحزاب من بينهم فويل للذين كفروا من مشهد يوم عظيم. أسمع بهم وأبصر يوم يأتوننا لكن الظالمون اليوم في ضلال مبين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Brothers and sisters, we will now continue the program with the main talk by Ali-Reza Bhojani. Please welcome him with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Dr. Ali-Reza Bhojani is a teaching fellow in Islamic Ethics and Theology at the University of Birmingham, where he is program lead for the MA in Islamic Studies. His research, teaching and writing focuses on intersections between Islamic legal theory, theology and ethics. Today he continues third part of his four-part series. Please welcome with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
If we could start with Surah Al-Fatiha for the souls of all our marhumeen. Al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع ذنوبنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبو القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم وهو الأصدق القائلين وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولو شاء ربك لأمن من في الأرض كلهم جميعا أفأنت تكره الناس حتى يكونوا مؤمنين صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. The verse which I've just recited loosely translates as follows. If your Lord had willed, لو شاء ربك, if your Lord had willed, He would have made the whole world believe, all of them, in their entirety. So now, would you enforce belief such that people come to believe? We've been thinking over the last few nights about a critical approach to religion, theology, belief, and practices. One which seeks a conscientious engagement, a willful submission. And we framed it initially around thinking about this resource which the Quran calls us to employ again and again, the mind, to think consciously about what we receive, to commit consciously, willfully towards these teachings, this expertise, and these resources, such that we have this increasing submission with attentiveness. And we gave some examples of how even the practices of Salah, the practices of Islam, seek to inculcate and promote a conscientious engagement with the world in which we live, an attentive engagement with the world in which we live. The Salat itself is quite clear, is not effective without the engagement of that which is within. Through repetitive, concerted exercise of our minds, directing them towards God when we pray, we can achieve humility and attentiveness towards God when we go beyond our prayer. We saw yesterday that yes, a critical approach to religion, an emphasis as the Quran emphasizes upon human thought and human reasoning, will lead to diversity of opinions. But this diversity itself is something to be embraced, something to be engaged with, and again can be a means of humility for us, such that we recognize that the only way to go beyond our own limits, our own akal, if you remember linguistically in Arabic, the word akal comes from restraint. It's a limit. The only way to go beyond our own limits is to be open to learn from others in pursuit of that which this is all directed towards. Greater understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek to grow in our ma'rifah. Now when we frame such a reclaiming of Islam as a reform, as a conscious submission, as an attentive practice, an attentive ethics, a conscientious belief, when we frame this in light of the memory of Hussain ibn Ali, salawatullahi wassalamu alayhi, we see that it's intended to be a God-centered reform through and through. You know, when things are turning upside down around us, or maybe within us, the constant for the believer is God. Imam Husayn is reported to have said, on his way to Karbala, I'm quoting from apart from a longer speech, أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنَّ الْحَقَّ لَا يُؤْمِلْ بِهِ. Don't you see that good isn't being called towards? وَأَنَّ الْبَاطِلَ لَا يُتَنَاهَى عَنْ. And that which is clearly false is not being prevented from. In this situation, لِيَرْغَبَ الْمُؤْمِنِ فِي لِقَاءِ اللَّهِ. Look, when things are upside down, whether it's within, because we experience turmoil, right? Whether it's through our daily lives, whether it's through our trials and tribulations, whether it's a situation we find ourselves in, or when we look at global circumstances, we find ourselves in turmoil. And of course, there was no greater turmoil than the turmoil experienced around the Muslims, which led to the killing of Hussain ibn Ali. Imam Husayn was saying, turn to the meeting of God. So a reform should, of course, always be directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then this pursuit of betterment. Remember we said reform has two. A critical discourse of reform within religion has two components. One is simply betterment, improvement, building on that which we have. It's not about throwing away that which we have received of these beautiful teachings and traditions. No, building consciously, thinkingly on what we have. And yes, removing that which is corrupt. Questioning that which is not fitting with our ideas of God, with these beautiful examples of the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. We see that it's a movement towards God. Hussain ibn Ali is reported to have said in that beautiful dua, capturing it so clearly, that ultimately the movement is meant to be towards Allah. It says, مَاذَا وَجَدَ مَنْ فَكَدَكَ. What have we gained? In any aspiration, in any pursuit, what have we gained if we have lost you? وَمَاذَا فَقَدَ مَنْ وَجَدَكَ. And what has he lost? The one who has gained you. So over the last few nights, where I've been seeking to encourage and remind us of the Quranic discourse of thinking, the beautiful resources within our scholarly tradition, within the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, of an emphasis upon reason, of thinking, of criticality. As we mentioned on the first night, Al-Aqal alladhi ubida bihi ar-Rahman. According to the words attributed to Imam Sadiq, it is the mind through which the most merciful is acquired, is worshipped, and through which the heavens are secured. We've been talking about a critical approach to religion which is absolutely committed to God. Absolutely committed to God. Which is seeking to draw concepts from within this tradition, within its teachings, within the efforts of centuries of minds and people. But when we think about critique and Islam, criticism from within the tradition is not the only criticism that we find. And I try to point out that these resources that we're talking about are different from a secular critique of religion from outside. But if we want to think about critique and Islam, it's only right that we do think a little bit about the criticisms of Islam and how to respond to them. Those criticisms which don't come with a commitment to God, which don't have that fundamental moral compass and aspiration beyond which there is no real aspiration. So how do we deal with these criticisms of Islam? Because we live in a time where it's rampant, where criticism of Islam is forthright, is pervasive. If we want to think about the contemporary discourse, Baroness Warsi famously said, Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test. It's often implicit. Sometimes it's unconscious now, the prejudice against Islam. But these criticisms of Islam which underpin that discourse, of course, often go beyond simply criticism. They're going to mockery. They're going to defamation. They're going to ridicule of Islam. And actually to symbols that we hold dear. The Quran itself, the Prophet of God. how to respond to such criticisms from people beyond the tradition, and sometimes from people who have indeed left the tradition. So I want to just point briefly to a few Quranic principles to help us think through this together, and maybe leave a longer time for questions because we have experts in this area in the room. First and foremost, we have to remember when we think about external criticism of Islam and our responses to it, that the Quranic vision of belief is intended to be free. The Quranic vision of belief unequivocally is one which promotes and seeks willful, conscientious, thinking, submission. The verse of the Quran which I began with, it's emphatic. لو شاء ربك لأمن من في الأرض كلهم جميعا. It's like in this one verse you've got this triple emphasis. Okay, if your Lord, this Lord is so dear to us, this nurturing Lord, the one who is, as we said, the aspiration of every believer, says, your Lord, if he had wished, he could have made whosoever on the earth. Whosoever is on the earth, first emphasis. All of them, second emphasis. In their entirety, he could have made them believers. But Allah did not. The verse continues with this rhetorical question. أَفَأَنْتَ تُكْرِهُ النَّاسَ حَتَّى يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. Now will you force people such that they become believers? Belief was intended to be free, and it can be no other way. Look, all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do is give us capacity and give us evidence. The prophets, all they could do is give us evidence, point us towards the truth. It is now for us to fight our stubbornness, to fight our veils, and to accept or to reject. In this famous verse of the Quran, which we may have been blessed to be taught as children, and still we teach our children, La ikraha fid deen. There is no compulsion in religion. Yes, jurists in history have understood this verse as abrogated, but we see it as an untenable position. This is a principle which the Quran says again and again. It can be no other way. Belief has to be conscious. It has to be willful. In one of the most condemned categories in the Quran is the hypocrite. Right? The one who professes belief but doesn't actually believe within. You see, belief is a free choice. Yeah, belief is something which is a cognitive practice. Some would say it's involuntary. We don't have control over it. Okay? We can purify ourselves. We can try to assess the evidence. We can try to clear the grounds. We need to inculcate that humility, that openness, that willingness to learn. And then we need to follow the direction of the evidence. La ikraha fid deen. Of course, the Quran condemns those who obstinately and stubbornly leave the religion. That their acts will lead to nothing in the world to come. They will receive the most severest of condemnation. But the Quran prescribes no temporal, no worldly punishment for somebody who out of their choice of conscience didn't accept and chose to leave Islam. And we see some of the giants of contemporary scholarship, of recent generations, revising and reviewing those historical rules which condemned and gave the harshest of worldly punishments to those who left the religion. People like the now late Ayatollah Hussain Muntazari, Ayatollah Sayyid Musawi al-Ardabili. They said, look, this historical punishment was for those who left Islam as an act of political treason. There is no worldly punishment for somebody out of a choice of conscience, for following their understanding, chose to leave Islam. So the Quranic vision of belief is one which is emphasizing and in fact seeking an increasing willful, non-coerced submission to God, Islam. Second principle is that we see that the Quran it invites challenges. It invites criticism. Right? And we see this on a number of occasions, famously in a way which, again, many of us have been reminded of. You know, the Quran gives this open challenge. Am yakuluna iftarah? You know, do you consider it a lie? Talking about its own self. The Quran tells its audience, do you consider these words to be a lie? Then bring a surah like it. Elsewhere, Am yakuluna iftara, do you consider it a lie? Okay, challenge. You bring 10 surahs like it. Elsewhere, fa'tu min surah, bring a single surah like it. Look, the Quran emphasizes freedom of belief, is open to a critical engagement with those who haven't accepted it, who don't have that submission, who aren't committed to the tradition. It accepts the challenges. But when we look around us today, we see the criticism which Islam is often bombarded with in the contemporary context widely goes beyond rational criticism and reasonable criticism. We have outright defamation, mockery, okay, and ridiculing of Islam, ridiculing of the symbols of Islam. How do we respond to this? You know, because this hurts, right? When people are portraying a prophet who we have been grown with as the beloved of our hearts, you know, the one who's known as the truthful, you know, who looked after his enemies, you know, who cared for the widows and the orphans and moved society forward, who changed the directions of the rights of women, you know, who brought together family units. And then we see such an individual who touches the hearts of billions around the world being ridiculed. It hurts. When the Quran, you know, this direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, Imam Ali describes this as the rope of God. One hand, one side is in the heavens and the other is with us. This direct connection with God. When it is burned and when it is trampled upon, this hurts. And this is not reasonable, rational criticism. Right? This is mockery. Yeah? This is insult. Right? And we see that actually this criticism of Islam being weaponized. You know, often for political gain or personal gain, right? Where we have and leading to increasing polarization. You know, when we have emphasis on, yes, freedom of belief, you know, ability to critical engagement with religious practices, okay, freedom of expression, we see that some things are weaponized and certain communities are targeted, often for political and personal reasons. And the responses to this, we need to think about carefully. Because in our responses to this ridicule and this mockery, often we're adding to the polarization. Right? And we see polarization as a wider, and what do I mean by polarization? That people are just going further and further apart. Right? Radically moving apart. You have a point of tension, a point of difference, and yes, we may say unacceptable attitudes, baseless attitudes towards Islam, but what does it lead? Okay, that attack, and often the response leads to us moving in absolutely opposite directions. And this type of polarization, of course, is a feature of our wider society. You know, sometimes it's a case of polarization within the Shia community because of differences, because of tensions. Sometimes it's a case of polarization amongst Muslims. You know, when we talk about the symbols being ridiculed, sometimes we feel it's the symbols of the Shia which are ridiculed. Sometimes we feel it's the symbols of the Sunnis which are ridiculed. And in the responses to that ridiculing, we see increasing polarization. In wider society, if we look at things like the culture wars and this right to not be offended being used again very seriously to increase divisions within society. So how do we respond? I want to just read 2 ayat of the Quran and use this genuinely, okay, as a platform for us to think together. Because we're saying the Quran is inviting us to think. So let's try to think through the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He gives a similar message to the Prophet of Islam. And of course the Prophet of Islam was being not just criticized, you know, for saying this is a revelation from God, but he was being mocked. He was being ridiculed. Okay? There was irrational, immoral treatment of the Prophet salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi in his time. In response to this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتُ I'm reading from Surah Al-An'am, the 68th verse. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا. It says, when you see the people who are diving in at our signs, our symbols. This يَخُوضُونَ, what does it mean? So the Mufassirin have widely agreed. That is literally يَخُوضُ kind of means to dive in. Okay? It doesn't just mean that they were diving in at the signs, those things beloved, the Quran, the Prophet himself, the symbols of Islamic religiosity, you know, the things that we hold dear. You know, we spend our lives trying to inculcate reverence for them, rely upon them. And the Prophet is told, إِذَا رَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا. Yakhudu here is understood as being when you see those people who are obstinately rejecting, who are mocking, who are ridiculing our signs. فَأْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ. Turn away from them. Right? So in this context of being ridiculed, we're not talking about rational engagement here. We're not talking about reasonable critique. We're talking about cases where somebody is mocking. Right? And sometimes the dividing line might be difficult, but in most cases it's quite clear. Right? And we can see this even in our ordinary lives outside the case of religion. Sometimes we can have disagreements with people. Okay? And sometimes people are just absolutely disparaging us. At that point, the Quran is telling the Prophet, and in the other ayat, the believers, to just step back. Turn away. Look, it's very easy right now to go online and type in a question about the Prophet Muhammad. You know, was the Prophet Muhammad X or Y? And suddenly, you know, was he a supporter of women's rights? Okay, and on the feeds that you see, you'll see the most ugly responses to these questions. It seems that there are professional, you know, full-time Islamophobes, all right, seeking to spread, okay, ridicule on the name of the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the Prophet in such situations, when he was being ridiculed, the signs of God were being mocked, فَأْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ. Turn away from them. So we may say, hang on a minute, Ali-Reza, you were talking about the problem of polarization. Right? The problems that we have in society, that when we have a problem, these problems become so big that we completely move away from each other. We have to read the verse, keep reading the verse. The verse says, turn away from them. حَتَّى يُخُوضُ فِي حَدِيثٍ غَيْرِهِ. Until they start to engage in some other conversation, in some other issue. Look, despite the widespread, it is widespread, we have to be honest, not criticism, ridicule of Islam and its symbols. Yet the Quran teaches us not to disengage entirely. Look, at the point where it's unreasonable, where it's ridiculed, step away. Until they move on. Until they move on. Look, the Quran of course asks us to respond, to call to the way of your Lord. Remember we said the way of your Lord was willful, conscientious submission to truth. Ud'u ila sabili rabbik. Call to the way of your Lord. Through beautiful speech. Through wisdom. Ud'u ila sabili rabbik bil hikmati wal maw'idhati al hasana wajadilhum. Call to the way of your Lord through wisdom, through beautiful speech. And yes, argue with them, engage with them, but in the most beautiful manner. Look, we see this as a basic principle, to always seek to respond. Yes, the Quran gives us rights in certain situations to respond like for like. But the ethics of Ahlul Bayt and the standard to which the Quran pushes us to is always to respond in manners which are better than we are being faced with. In that beautiful ethical principle of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, of course, وَلَا تَسْتَوِيَ الْحَسَنَةِ وَلَا السَّيِّئَةِ. Look, beauty is not the same as that which is disgusting. Idfa, push back. Yes, push back. Idfa billati hiya ahsan, but push back in the most beautiful of ways. Let's not lower ourselves to the way people are ridiculing us. فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ. If we treat others with the beautiful ethics of God, with the ethics of the Prophet, with the ethics of the Ahlul Bayt, فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ. Then if there is between you and between them enmity, كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. Soon it will be as though they were intimate friends. When we look consistently, when we look at the ethics of the Prophet, the ethics of the Ahlul Bayt, they always sought to respond to challenges in the most befitting, in the most beautiful, in the most godly ways. Of course, when we say Hussain ibn Ali, and in many ways Hussain ibn Ali's stand in Karbala started with him turning away. Fa'rid an. Look, it started with this act of not giving allegiance. It was a negative act. He said, no, I can't give allegiance to somebody whose rule effectively mocks Islam, effectively ridicules the message of Muhammad, the message of the Quran. Of course, as the situation unfolded, he was not treated with the godly ethics of the Quran, and he was not treated with the godly ethics of Muhammad Rasulullah, to be left ultimately thirsty, lying on the plains of Karbala with his head severed from his neck. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. Alayka minni salamullahi abada ma baqitu wa baqiya al-layla wa nahar wa la ja'ala Allahu akhir al-ahdi minni li ziyaratikum. Assalamu ala al-Husayn wa ala Ali ibn al-Husayn wa ala awlad al-Husayn wa ala ashab al-Husayn. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you very much. We now have some time for questions.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Ali-Reza, for that very relevant message here. Now, the problem is when the provocation gets too much or too close, if you like, to the heart. Somebody mocking the Prophet, somebody burning the Quran or something. What are the ethics of restraint on our side? I mean, there is patience and so on, but we are also emotional in that sense. So how do we square that circle?
So I think that this verse, I only read one of the two verses. We find a very similar message in Surah An-Nisa. Okay, I will read the ayah if that's okay. Bismillah. Okay, I'll come back to it. Look, we find in the it seems to me that this ayah is directly addressing that question. Okay, and we have to think. We can even just examine the situation. Look, we've seen, some of us may have looked at those pictures in 2011 of Charlie Hebdo, okay, caricaturing, okay, or giving a caricature of a person, right? Okay, who they wanted to associate with the Prophet Muhammad salawatullahi wasalamuhu alayhi. What image caused more harm and was more widespread? Was it the images in Charlie Hebdo, or was it the images of the emotional Muslim responses and the indiscriminate, irrational, in my view, okay, irrational boycotting of a whole country? All right, this was one newspaper which ridiculed the Prophet. Okay, sought to ridicule Muslims. And we had an irrational response, an emotional response. Now we can understand the emotion because these are our symbols. This is ayat in our, right? We can understand, but the Quran was saying, look, fa'rid anhu. Okay, the Quran was saying turn away at that point. Okay, then we need to look at the rest of the Quranic message to say, yes, respond, but respond in the most beautiful of ways. Right? So we need to take the emotion out of that situation. Okay, and actually look at practically what has been the response. Even when we see incidents closer to the time of Charlie Hebdo, we see similar challenges. Look, ultimately, the Quran is giving a vision where there is freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom to criticize. Okay, within the way these now formed as rights have been institutionalized, there is no right in international law not to be offended. Right? So we can take offense, okay, and we are offended, but we need to respond in a befitting manner. So I think we actually have to take the emotion out of it. And maybe this is why the Quran says fa'rid anhu. It doesn't say don't do anything about it. Because of course the Quran is calling us to call to good, to call to the way of God, but to do so in the most beautiful of ways.
Thank you for your speech. Forgive me, I may not have caught the first two lectures or perhaps even the first half of today's speech, but the question I wanted to ask is, in an arena of polarization or even fractionalization, the question I would have is, when there is an avid social media available and when people are using large amounts of criticism, actually large amounts of big data to be able to analyze both sides of the equation and to stoke both sides of the equation for personal conflict and personal gain, if you will, or for societal conflict and societal gain, how do you take emotion out of it in a macro context? In a micro context, I can regulate my behavior, perhaps, but in a macro context, how does that happen?
Yeah, okay, so excellent question. So actually, I think in a macro context, emotion doesn't work anyway. Right? So if we're thinking macro, if we want to think how can we holistically respond to such widespread, systematic, and I would say not criticism. Criticism, I think, is welcome, right? Okay, not reasonable criticism, but how do we respond to wide-scale, wholesale ridiculing? Right? Emotion just doesn't work. Right? So, and we would hope not to take the emotion out of our hearts. Right? Yeah, the emotion should drive us to act. All right? Emotion is something healthy. Right? Emotion is something good. All right? It should drive us to act. But it should drive us to act in a reasoned, thought-out way. All right? So it seems to me that this is the Quranic ethics. The Quran is not going to tell us how to, deal with, as you say, systematic, data-driven algorithms being used on Twitter feeds, all right, to promote certain visions. All right? Quran, we can mine the Quran for an ethics. Yeah, and I think this Quranic ethics is saying at that point of the heated emotion, step back. Look, we see it, there's popular stories where we see the Imams did this on individual instances. A famous popular story, Imam Ali, salamullahi alayhi, on the battlefield is spat in the face. He's being ridiculed. Right? The popular story is, what did he do? He stepped back. Right? He stepped back because sometimes our emotions unchecked, okay, can have results we don't intend. No, we need the emotion. We need to inculcate the love of our Prophet, the love of our Quran, the love of our symbols, but then use that emotion to try to share the vision that they had of Islam and of ethics more widely. And first and foremost through our characters.
Asya.
Is there a question there?
Salam, thank you for your lecture. My question is mainly to do with yesterday's lecture, if that's okay. You spoke about how there were lots of different, I want to get the phrase you used right, I think you said traditions of reason within Islam and how we have a multiplicity of interpretation. And I was wondering, to what extent are all of these interpretations valid, and how do we kind of reconcile it with the concept of truth in Islam and kind of essentially like the unity of the message,
Sure.
and by truth, the kind of truth with a capital T?
Sure, excellent. Okay, so it's a brilliant question. So if we have traditions of reason in Islam, so different theological, just to put it back into the context of some of the people might not have been here yesterday. So if we have different theological traditions, different approaches to understanding belief, which actually conceive of human reasoning in different ways, and they come to different understandings, usually in the details of belief rather than in the fundamentals of those doctrines, like there is a God, there is a prophet, there is a life to come. Right? How do we reconcile that with the truth with a capital T? So look, theologians, Muslims, okay, ordinary Muslims, we believe in truth with a capital T. Right? Okay? Yeah, and there is either the world to come is eternal or it's not. Okay? Yeah, either the world to come is physical or it's not. It can't be both. Right? Okay, so when it comes to what the theologians described as the rational matters of doctrine, the truth, capital T, must be one. Either there's one God or it's a Trinitarian God. Okay, either there's one God or there's no God. Right? So these matters of fundamental truths ultimately must be one. However, our accountability is in accordance with our understanding. Right? So we're accountable to the truth to the extent that we understand it through sincere search and sincere willful submission to the truth as it is disclosed to us. Right? So where a belief may well be wrong, okay, if it was the result of one's best efforts, okay, if it was the result of using the capacities and opportunities that I have been privileged to have, okay, even if it was wrong, surely a just God, okay, could not condemn me for it. Right? So truth, to summarize, truth is one, but our accountability and our responsibility is relative. Relativity, people worry about relativity. Okay, but this type of vision is not relativity of the truth. The truth is one and we're all seeking it. What the Prophet beautifully said, Talabul ilm faridatun ala kulli muslimin wa muslimatin. The seeking of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge is our responsibility. Whether we manage to acquire it or not, okay, this is the grace of God.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Brothers and sisters, we will now start the Maqtal and Marshia recitations. We hope that the delivery of the most poignant aspects of Imam Husayn's journey through a series of conversations will help our audience better relate to and encourage further observations of this pivotal episode in our history. Great effort has been made to keep true to authentic sources such as Sheikh Mufid, as well as tapping into different forms of observation across the Shi'i world. We're always open to suggestions and comments that help us on our collective journey towards fulfilling our duties towards Allah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In this English Noha, the poet narrates a conversation between Lady Zainab Salamullah alayha and Imam Husayn alayhi salam, where they bid farewell to each other. And each verse ends with statements of reassurance and affirmation of our nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So please do recite with me, inshallah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes, love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes, love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes. Zainab, my sweet, they will bind both your feet, they will tear away your veil. Oh, they'll come for Ali, they will curse him 'cause of me, they will torture him, you'll see, and will never be far from the pain of Ashura, from the pain of Ashura, and will never be far from the pain of Ashura, from the pain of Ashura. Love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes, love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes. Oh, they'll curse Mustafa and my father Murtada, for they hate all that is good and all good for which they stood. From my mother they did steal, yet the truth Allah revealed, and will never be far from the pain of Fatima, from the pain of Fatima, and will never be far from the pain of Fatima, from the pain of Fatima. Love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes, Hussain. Light of my eyes, love of my heart, you're the eyes where the sands dry as hell, where the holy blood did spill, where the souls of martyrs dwell. My sweet Zainab, do not fear. No, Allah is always near. No, Allah all things does hear, and will never be far from the pain of Karbala, from the plain of Karbala, and will never be far from the plain of Karbala, from the plain of Karbala. Love of my heart, light of my eyes, love of my heart, my eyes, we will face cursed Yazid. After evil he did lead, you will teach what is right. In my face he will strike. To Allah we will return, for this meeting we do yearn, and will never be far from the call of Allah, from the call of Allah, and will never be far from the call of Allah. Love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes. Eyes, love of my heart, you're the of my eyes. We will fight until the end, for this love we will defend. On Allah we will depend. To fight oppression is our way, and from now till judgment day, oh, these words we will pray, and will never be far from the path of Allah, from the path of Allah, and will never be far. MashaAllah, love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes. Hussain, light of my eyes. Love of my heart, you're the light of my eyes. Hussain, light of my eyes. Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.
Imam Husayn received numerous letters inviting him to Kufa, and so he decided to make his way there. Before he left, his cousin Ibn Abbas tried to dissuade the Imam from making the journey. He said to him,
"May Allah have mercy on you. God willing, you will not be obliged to carry out on this decision. Have they expelled their governor and taken control of the town? If they have, then go. However, if they have invited you whilst they are still oppressed, then they are only inviting you to instigate war and rebellion. I have no confidence in them. I suspect that they may be deceiving you and lying to you, and they may oppose you and abandon you. My cousin Hussein, I beg you to exercise patience. I fear that in this mission you will be destroyed. Surely the people of Iraq are deceitful and unreliable. If the Iraqis truly want you to come to Kufa, then ask them to first remove their enemies before you set out to them. If you are determined to leave Mecca, then go to Yemen. It is a vast land. From there you can invite people to support you, and may Allah make your mission successful."
Imam replied,
"Cousin, by Allah, I am certain that you are sincerely concerned about me. But I have taken a decision and am determined to undertake this journey."
Ibn Abbas counselled him not to take his women or children, as he feared that the Imam would be killed and that they would be left unprotected. As others came to hear about Imam Husayn's journey, they also came to him, expressing similar concerns. Some, such as Ibn Zubair, suggested that Imam Husayn assume the leadership in Mecca, and he will be given assistance, support, advice, and allegiance. Imam responded,
By Allah, I would much rather be killed a short distance away from the sacred precinct than be killed within it. I swear by Allah, they would apprehend me and seize me even if I were hidden in a deep snake hole. By Allah, they will violate the honor and sanctity of the city and my life.
On the way to Kufa, Imam Husayn stopped at a place called Sifa, where he met a poet called Farazdak bin Ghalib. Imam Husayn asked Farazdak for news from Kufa. Farazdak replied,
You have asked someone who knows the situation. The hearts of the people are with you, but their swords are with Banu Umayyah. The decree will come from heaven, and Allah will do whatever He desires.
Imam responded,
You have said the truth. The decree belongs to Allah, and He will do what He desires. He has power over all affairs. If the decree that He sends down is what we desire, then we praise Him. If fate may frustrate our hopes, He does not destroy those whose intention is the truth and whose hearts are pious.
As Imam Husayn continued his journey, he sent a letter to Kufa with Qais ibn Mushir, Saydawi. However, on the way to Kufa, Qais was stopped and killed under the orders of Ubaydullah bin Ziyad. Along the way, Imam Husayn also met people, some of whom who joined him on his journey. At a place called Zarud, Imam Husayn set camp. He also sent a messenger asking Zuhair ibn Qayn a messenger asking to meet Zuhair ibn Qayn. Zuhair was eating his meal with his wife Dilham when the message of invitation came. Zuhair was reluctant to go for fear of what may be asked for him.
Glory be to Allah.
Zuhair's wife said to him,
Did the son of the messenger of Allah send for you? Then aren't you going to him? Go to him, hear what he has to say. Then you can leave him if you wanted to.
Zuhair ibn al-Qayn went to him. It was not long before he returned to announce that he was heading east with the Imam. He ordered his tent packed away and called for his luggage and equipment. His tent was pulled down and taken to Hussein. Then he said to his wife,
You are divorced. Go back to your family, for I do not want anything bad to befall upon you.
Then he said to his companions,
Whoever wants to follow me may do so. Otherwise he is at the end of his covenant with me. I will tell you a story of something which happened to me once. We were raiding a rich land. Allah granted us victory, and we won a lot of booty. Salman al-Farsi, the mercy of Allah be upon him, said to us, Are you happy with the victory which Allah has granted you, and the booty you have won? We said, Yes. Then he said, Therefore, when you meet the young men of the family of Muhammad, be happier to fight with them than you are with the booty which you have obtained today. As for me, I pray that Allah be with you.
At a place called Labiyah, Imam Husayn was with his companions when he received news from a group of horsemen that his cousin, Muslim ibn Aqil and Hani, had been murdered. Having told his servants and entourage to collect water, Imam Husayn informed his followers of this news and told them that those who wished to leave were free to do so. The people began to disperse from his left and right until there only remained his followers from Medina and a few who had joined them. Imam Husayn continued his journey towards Kufa with the remainder of his followers. As they made their way towards Kufa, they were intercepted by the army of Yazid, led under the control of Hur ibn Riyahi.
يا حسين أنت حررت العبيد يا حسين ذكرك صار نشيد يا حسين قطعوا منك الوريد يا حسين يا غريبا يا شهيد
ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन
थी ये सब को खबर
ये जहां सब है तेरा, हाँ मगर ये सिला तुझको उम्मत से मिला था। तेरा सारा तन तीरों से इतना भरा, गिर के फिर रुक गया तीरों पे लाशा तेरा। ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन। ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन। अंत क़ुरबानुल इलाह, अंत लिद्दीन फिदा, दमुक अस्सादा उला, क़द्दसल बारी सना। या हुसैन या हुसैन صرت للدنيا منار. يا حسين يا حسين ذكرك أضحى شعار. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन. How Yazid tried to bury your name into the sand, covered up Karbala, but this was Allah's command, that Hussain will live on in this world, in every land. Till the end we will mourn our master's final stand. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन. हर जवां पीर के दिल से उठती है सदा, अपने खून से जलाए हमेशा का दिया. जिंदगी कुछ नहीं गर न हो शह की अज़ा, इसकी खातिर करें कि हम अपनी जान फिदा. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन. ये ज़मीन आसमां कह रहा है या हुसैन, मोमिनों के लहू में बह रहा है या हुसैन.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. وصل اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة. قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى محمد. الله أكبر. حول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم
صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. رب صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. حول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وعلى سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك والنجاة من النار ومن كل بلية والفوز بالجنة والرضوان في دار السلام وجوار نبيك محمد عليه وآله السلام. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك لا إله إلا أنت استغفرك وأتوب إليك.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ashhadu anna aliyan hujjatullah, hayya ala salat, hayya ala salat, hayya ala al-falah, hayya ala al-falah, hayya ala khairil amal, hayya ala khairil amal. Qad qamatis salat, qad qamatis salat. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر الله أكبر الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر استغفر الله ربي الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر حول الله وقوته بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد الله أكبر ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب رب صل على محمد الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى حول الله وقوته الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر استغفر الله ربي وأتوب الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر حول الله وقوته الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد الله أكبر استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وعلى السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم إنه ليس لي علم بموضع رزقي وإنما أطلبه بخطرات تخطر على قلبي فأجول في طلبه البلدان فأنا فيما أنا طالب كالحيران لا أدري أفي سهل وأم في جبل أم في أرض أم في سماء أم في بر أم في بحر وعلى يدي من ومن قبل من وقد علمت أن علمه عندك وأسبابه بيدك وأنت الذي تقسمه بلطفك وتسببه برحمتك اللهم فصل على محمد وآله واجعل يا رب رزقك لي واسعا مطلبه سهلا ومأخذه قريبا ولا تعنني بطلب ما لم تقدر لي فيه رزقا فإنك غني عن عذابي وأنا فقير إلى رحمتك فصل على محمد وآله وجد على عبدك بفضلك إنك ذو فضل عظيم. Brothers and sisters, before Ziyad, we're just going to have a short talk by Riaz Ismail on behalf of the Islam Center. Please welcome him with salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Riaz Ismail. I'm one of the trustees of the Salam Center. And what the trustees would like to do, with your permission of course, is to take the opportunity over the next few nights to update you all on the progress of the development of the Salam Center. And we'll be touching on various different aspects of the development, but let me begin by trying to explain some of the reasons behind the hiatus in the building works, why it slowed down quite considerably to the pace at which it was before. So as you all know, following the terrible tragedy at Grenfell, there is an intense focus on public safety. And this is something that, of course, the trustees wholeheartedly support. It's very important for us to get things right, especially when the safety of our community and the wider community is concerned. So, as you all know, the Salam Center building in itself is very innovative. Not only do we use innovative materials, but our building techniques are also very new. For example, the canopy material that we're going to be using to cover the whole of the center is a synthetic porcelain type of material. And the way that it is actually fixed onto the wider structure is also quite unique. And of course, as a result of that, we had to prove to the authorities beyond any doubt whatsoever that it was completely safe in the event of any fire or any type of combustion that would result in a similar tragedy that we had in Grenfell. So as a result of that, it took a lot of experimentation, testing, before we could prove to everyone to their complete satisfaction that this was the case. And with your prayers, and we thank you for them, we're now in that position that we've been able to give comfort to the building regulators and all the regulators that we're in that position. So the next stage of the building is to create what's called a shell and core. What that will give us at the end is a building like you see in the photographs. It'll be completely watertight. We'll have all the windows and everything in place, but it'll be empty inside. The third phase, we'll then look at building the inside of it, and then the fourth stage, we'll be looking at finishing it all off in the way that we would like to see at the end of the project. There are a number of other aspects that we need to explain over the next few nights. one of the things we'll be touching upon is looking at the type of contract we have. It's called a design and build contract. Some of you might be familiar with this, others may not. So what we'll do is take the opportunity over the next few nights to explain exactly what that means, what our responsibility is, and what the contractor's responsibility is in helping us to deliver that. We went through a very rigorous tender process to make sure that we were absolutely fair in choosing the people who are actually going to build the next phase of the center for us. So we will describe to you what we did in terms of doing that and how we actually selected the preferred bidder. Of course, we'll have to talk to you about funding because we have some money that we can spend. We'll need more money. And what we don't want to do is be in a position where we have to stop working because we've run out of money. So all of that has to be thought out, and we want to involve you in that discussion and in that plan. Inevitably, there will be lots of questions that you may have, some detailed, some general, and we welcome them all. So over the next few days, we'll all be here, inshallah. Feel free to come up to any of the trustees and ask any questions that you may have. But if you think that you would like to actually put your thoughts down on paper and send them to us, even if it's virtual, then we have an email address. It's office@thesalamcenter.com. Any comments you have, any ideas you have, anything you can feel you can do to help us build the center, send it to office@thesalamcenter.com. So I end by asking you all to remember the Salam Center in your prayers. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your mourning and our mourning for the tragedy of Imam Husayn alayhi salam as part of our worship. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alayka ya sayyidi ya mawla ya Rasulullah. Assalamu alayka ya sayyidi ya mawla ya Nabiyullah. Assalamu alayka ya sayyidi ya mawla ya Muhammad ibn Abdullah wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. السلام عليك وعلى ابن أمك أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وصية الرسول رب العالمين. السلام عليك وعلى بضعتك الصديقة الطاهرة فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليك وعلى زوجتك الوفية الغراء خديجة الكبرى أم المؤمنين. السلام عليك وعلى والديك الإمامين الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. السلام عليك وعلى أئمة المسلمين من ذرية ولدك الحسين علي السجاد ومحمد الباقر وجعفر الصادق وموسى الكاظم وعلي الرضا ومحمد الجواد وعلي الهادي والحسن العسكري والحجة بن الحسن المهدي. السلام عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله مخرجك وظهورك وجعلنا من أنصارك وأعوانك والمستشهدين بين يديك. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Brothers and sisters, please can I request you to recite Surah Fatiha for Marhum Azad Ali, Jafar Ali, Qasim, who passed away 3 years ago, and for all our Marhumin. Surah Fatiha.